Let's cross now to SABC News anchor Sakina Kamwendo, who is in Tshwane, I understand, with the SABC News Political Editor Mzwandile Mbeje, as well as Dr. Ronesh, and they'll dissect what we're expecting today.
Well, thank you so much, Griselda. And yes, we are awaiting the arrival of that procession here at the Union Buildings. But just to pick up, and Griselda picks up on where we left off with regard to the polling, the DA's internal polling, and of course, rubbishing the Ipsos poll. And obviously they would, because if you look at what that Ipsos poll says, it doesn't make good reading for the Democratic Alliance, but they haven't told us exactly what their own internal polling is saying. So if we could start there, Dr. Ronesh. So Ipsos, if we are to go by that, by the way, Helen Ziller says Ipsos gets it wrong.
Yeah.
Every time, and yet we keep referring to Ipsos, but then she does acknowledge that perhaps they are good at polling other things. So I'm not sure. What are we to make of this?
I think maybe the DA is just a little bitter. They're a little sour about the results of these Ipsos surveys and the other organizations who are doing these surveys. I take you back to 2016. Ipsos was one of the organizations at the forefront of actually correctly predicting that the ANC would dip below 50% in Gauteng's metros, Johannesburg, Tshwane, Ekurhuleni, as well as Nelson Mandela Bay Metro. They got it right back in 2016. I'm not sure about 2024, why the DA is probably attacking Ipsos, but whenever it comes to these surveys, obviously you need to take them with a pinch of salt. You need to look at the methodology. How many people were interviewed. You look at the Ipsos interviews, they were face-to-face interviews with 3,600 registered voters.
In their home language.
Yeah, probably. But the thing is also you need to consider you interviewing 3,600 people in a sample compared to 27.5 million people who are registered. So that's a very, very tiny sample that you're actually speaking to, regarding the elections. It's also the framing of the questions and the margin of error that you need to look at when these surveys and these polls come out. Obviously, one was Ipsos, the other one was the Social Research Foundation. Recently, they issued one, I think sometime last week. Their sample size was even smaller. They interviewed around 850 people, and these were face-to-face interviews. We had the other one, the Brenthurst Foundation, 1,600 people they interviewed, but those were telephonic interviews. So again, going back to the methodology, but if I were the DA, I would not, attack obviously any of these pollsters, because they did get it right. Ipsos did get it right back in 2016.
But to be fair, you can't pick and choose when you accept those results, because it may be a small sample, but the question is it a valid sample scientifically? That is important. And of course, as you say, in 2016, when things go your way, if it's in your favor, you accept it. If it's not, perhaps you don't. But all the same, we don't have to wait much longer. We only have a few months to election, so all of this will be borne out. But I want to, come to some of the policy issues with regard to the Democratic Alliance, and just look at some of those, because these are going to be very important touch points for the electorate in determining where they actually place their cross on election day. So let's start with, for example, the economy and the economic environment and what the DA proposes that they're going to do here. So they're talking about providing policy certainty to spur the growth of jobs at the very top. And this, of course, is top of mind for all South Africans, Mzwai.
Absolutely. In fact, every successful country and successful economy as well. So you do need a policy certainty. So we don't have to like it. We do want to know where you stand, so that the investors then are able to take a decision based on exactly who you are and then what you prefer. But then there are realities also on the ground that you should also factor in. So what does that policy certainty say? Does it then perhaps tend to exclude others and incorporate others? So those are all the areas that you need to look at. But of course, from that point of view, so I guess that will be a welcome development from their part.
Absolutely, but of course we are still missing the nuts and bolts, the how. How exactly are you going to do this? Because we know that the economy and economic resuscitation has been stubbornly, resistant to whatever has been thrown at it for the longest time now.
Yeah.
So it's the how they mean to do this, Ronesh.
Yeah, I think the DA is one of those very few parties who actually govern in a few places in this country. They govern one province, the Western Cape, 2 metros. That's obviously Tshwane, where we are sitting now and coming to you live. And the other one is Cape Town, obviously, Cape Town. And then they govern 5 district municipalities and 24 local municipalities, mainly in the Western Cape. So they have that experience. They have that hands-on practical knowledge of how to govern and how to create jobs, spur economic growth, and those kind of things. If you go back to the 2019 election manifesto, obviously echoed by then leader Mmusi Maimane, one standout feature of that manifesto was to create at least one job in every household.
They repeat that in here. Yes.
So obviously, I think for the DA, very important is obviously, creating that economic growth, empowering municipalities, to spur those, job creation endeavors or initiatives.
But
how? How? Exactly. Lots of private sector investment. I take you back to 2019. The DA held a very famous march in the Johannesburg CBD. It was for the youth wage subsidy. And COSATU was the one who actually blocked the DA from reaching, obviously COSATU House at that time. And the DA, pointed all kinds of fingers at COSATU, asking him, why are you being an obstacle for young people actually wanting to empower themselves? So, when we talk about jobs, the DA is trying to do something. And those kind of initiatives, even in 2014 as well, they campaigned heavily on jobs for young people. Going back to young people, you look at the unemployment rates. The unemployment stats came out from Stats SA quite recently. 74% average unemployment in terms of the youth, 18 to 29-year-olds. That is catastrophic for a country such as South Africa. Even the EFF recognizes that. The ANC recognizes that as well. Obviously, it is an issue. It is an election issue, few months to elections. Most political parties will latch on to that.
Yeah, because what are those figures, for example, in the city of Tshwane? What are those figures in the city of Cape Town, in the Western Cape provincially, in those 24 local governments where they do govern? Is the picture any better than it is at national level? Because that would be an indicator, a direct indicator of whether your policies are in fact working.
I think they will perhaps argue that if you look at the the statistics of the Auditor General in terms of what has been happening, you would see that the Western Cape has been performing much better than the rest, and I think they would latch onto that. And the fact that some of the areas where they are governing, even outside of Western Cape, so Umgeni, for example. Oh, by the way, that's where they wanted to take their manifesto to, but I think they were scared of the rush of everyone going down there. So also their PR has been very good to project some of the good things that they've been doing. Not that there are no challenges. So Midval in Gauteng, so they will be pointing out at those areas where you have seen some improvements in the lives of the people. But of course, even with that improvement, there are huge challenges. And the big question that perhaps they've not been able to answer. So what are you doing to people like Sikalo Shikrega, for example? That's an informal settlement in Midval. So, not much has happened. Khayelitsha is the same as any other township outside of the DA-run municipality. We are here in Tshwane. We've just spoken about Mamelodi, Atteridgeville, and other areas. So there hasn't been much difference. Yes, there are areas in the Western Cape, particularly Cape Town, in terms of job creation, so in terms of the latest stats, which have been very positive, but you need to do much more than that. So when you are now faced with the possibility of running the entire country, so what strategies do you have for Rongoma, for example? So are you able to then bring in, because Western Cape may be easier because there are economic opportunities in areas where there would be no economic activity. So what is your strategy? What exactly are you going to do other than telling us about the obvious?
So do we hold the Democratic Alliance to a higher standard of perhaps proof of how they intend to do things because of the fact that they actually do govern in certain areas, in certain municipalities, in certain provinces? Do we hold them to a higher standard or a level of accountability than we would say the EFF or, maybe a party that hasn't yet had opportunity to do so?
I think we should. We should, because remember, the DA is also the official opposition in this country, in the National Assembly, after the ANC, obviously the governing party. But if you go back to what Mzwandile was talking about earlier on, the DA is very good at the numbers and using those numbers to trumpet their successes. In the Western Cape, they always boast about, we created the most number of jobs. In the last quarter released the Labour Force quarterly stats a couple of months ago in November, I think it was. I think in the Western Cape, they were the only province that created 53,000 jobs. So they're going to use those numbers to say that while the rest of the country and the other provinces are not creating that jobs, not creating economic growth, not creating conducive situations or the conducive context, for the creation of those jobs, the DA is actually working very hard in places where it actually governs. So going back to your question, Sakina, yes, they will be held to a higher standard. Unlike the EFF, and rightly so, they should. Unlike parties like the EFF or the ACDP or the IFP, obviously the IFP is in governance in municipalities in KZN, that kind of thing. But there is proof. The DA is in government. In the province, 2 metros, 5 district municipalities, 24 local. So the blueprint is there.
So I want to go back to that data dump.
Yeah.
Because we see this from national government as well, where we talk about the economy has grown and we've created X number of jobs. But do we actually interrogate what those jobs are? Because they could be seasonal for all we know. What type of jobs are we creating? Are they sustainable? Those sort of questions perhaps we need to interrogate more.
Especially, Sakina, if you then juxtapose that with the huge social grants that are being handed out to people. Why? Because we are trying to counter the joblessness. So if we are creating those jobs as a country now, not necessarily focusing on the DA, us as a country, so why do we have then 28 million people on social grants? In fact, that's the other area that the DA, I'll be very interested to hear what they have to say, particularly around that area.
Incidentally, during the State of the Nation address, I spoke to Siviwe Kwarube, the DA's leader in Parliament, and she said that they support the extension of the social development grant, which for me was quite interesting, given that as the DA has been touting for the longest time, we need to arrest that situation. So is this some sort of admission that this thing of creating jobs and stimulating the economy is not going so well?
I think for me it's an election issue. Going back to Mzwai's points again, you look at the social grant budget every year, it's around 150 billion, including the SRD grants, which is extended until next year, I am told. But obviously, why did the ANC extend it? It's 3 or 4 months before an election. They cannot stop the 350 grant, because should they do that, that 10 to 12 million people would possibly not choose the ANC on the ballot paper. So obviously the DA would very opportunistically say, we do support the grant. But come out of elections, there's a 5-year gap between this election and the next election. Possibly that stance will change.
So I want to argue that point further, because granted, it is election season and we will hear a lot of electioneering. However, the reality on the ground is that people are not working. And unless you put money into people's hands somehow, the inevitable will be some form of uprising, some form of, I don't know whether we are at a stage where a revolution, could take place, but if we do not, as a nation, put money into people's hands, we have a serious problem.
It's a serious problem. I mean, every country that will be successful would have to have its personnel or its people properly employed. And if you are lacking that, particularly amongst the young people, I know we are not at the stage where the Arab Spring happened. You know how it sparked, how it was sparked. It was something very similar. It actually was related to employment, because here was someone who was trying to fend for himself, and then the authorities had their own ideas. So would you rather support people to have some livelihood, or you are going to block them? So they have a huge challenge. In fact, whoever is going to take over is having a very big problem in terms of creating employment, because failure to create employment for the extended period of time will then be a recipe for that which you are speaking about. Perhaps we're not at the stage of the revolution, but the extended failure to do that, it's a breeding ground for the revolution.
So it doesn't really matter who is in power, for as long as those jobs don't exist, for as long as this economy is not growing in order to create a conducive environment for job growth, you're going to have to pay those grants one way or another.
Yeah. And I think, Sakina, very importantly for the DA, the one method of creating those jobs, especially at local level, was empowering small businesses, SMME development. And for the DA, that's the trick. That's how we're going to create those jobs at local level. But going back to Mzwai's point, we saw what happened with the Arab Spring in 2011. This Tunisian hawker, he was just selling, fruits and vegetables, I think it was, and the authorities attacked him. He had a master's degree, by the way, highly educated person, very skilled, but he was forced to sell vegetables on the pavement, on the sidewalk, and that ignited. We saw what happened, and that comes back to the 2021 July riots, especially in KZN and Gauteng. We saw the report from the Human Rights Commission. They single out a number of factors. One of those factors was people are unemployed. The poverty levels, people are suffering. So if the government, COSATU was very clear on this, by the way. COSATU has always maintained, and some of the other unions as well, has always maintained that a revolution is waiting to explode. Something is going to happen. Something's got to give. And I think the ANC saw that. The ANC saw what happened in KZN. Not all blame could have been attributed to the former president's incarceration in July that year. I think it was July 5th or thereabouts. So all blame was not heaped on Zuma's incarceration. It was a combination of that with the social conditions on the ground, especially in KZN, especially in Gauteng. Those are two economic powerhouses. Obviously the other one is the Western Cape as well. And that's why the DA, just to digress a little, that's why the DA is targeting those three provinces, KZN, Gauteng, the Western Cape. If they get control of those three provinces, then they effectively have control of the economic powerhouses of South Africa. Yeah,
and very interesting to see how they tackle this one, but it's not going to be an easy one. And then just looking at some of the other points they make, speaking about safe and stable economy to stimulate investment, obviously, more incentives for labor-absorbing industries such as manufacturing, with an introduction of a 15% corporate tax, but with conditions. That's an interesting one.
Well, I'm intrigued to know what those conditions are. Yeah, so Mzwa.
Yeah, it's this kind of beautiful talk ahead of the elections. Some of these things it's easier to say because you are not there yet. So what exactly are you going to do? What exactly are you going to do? One of the things that would really appreciate when perhaps some of the leaders speak is to give the detail of we intend to charge the corporate tax from this person in this way, and then that will give us a clear idea. But remember, we are in an election season. Say that which will be heard easily by the people, and perhaps which will be responded to quite quickly. So the biggest challenge for me, for the DA, if it were to take over, is how do they then deal with the difficulties that the ANC is going through. I'm not necessarily speaking for the ANC here, but I can tell you they have been trying in some areas to try and deal with this problem, but it seems to be way too big. So how do you then navigate that and deal with it? So it is quite it's quite something, honestly, to look at our country currently, its economic challenges, because you look at the load shedding situation. You want to bring investors. So there's quite a lot that we need to do. Maybe it's time for the political parties to basically say, we need to go back to basics. What is it that makes the country work? Tick. Let's prioritize on that one. Let's stop this big English about what we're going to do. Let's just focus on the basics. And
this seems to be what everybody is doing. But of course, both of you invoking the Arab Spring, and you talk about skilled people who are unemployed. Just this week, we were reporting about doctors, medical doctors who are unemployed in this country. And that, I think, just drives home the point of just how dire the situation is. If you can have medical doctors who are unemployed. But then, of course, speaking of, the DA also talks about making it easier for foreign skilled workers to attain visas into South Africa.
Sakina, I think the ANC is very strong on that policy as well. So maybe they took a leaf off, out of the ANC's playbook as well, because the ANC quite recently has been very strong about attracting those foreign skills. Going to your point about unemployed doctors, how do you balance those two?
Yes, because which skills are we talking about? And I think there needs to be clarity there, because and one of the doctors that I was listening to was making the point about we are employing Cuban doctors, yet South African doctors are unemployed. And how do we balance that equation such that it doesn't antagonize people?
Especially in areas, look at our health situation. So we need to improve that one quite significantly. If then you have people who can be able to assist, what is stopping you from capacitating those areas? What is stopping you from giving those doctors the possibility really to remedy or to correct the situation? I think whoever takes over will have their work cut out for them, because clearly there's so much that needs to be done. And I was looking at the doctors' protest as well, and then hearing someone who's been at the hospital and lacking the basics couldn't be seen by the doctor because the doctor is not available. So how do we reconcile that? So I think a discussion of us as the country, perhaps forget about politics, of us as a country, what are our priorities as a country? What is it that will make us to be able to move forward from the health perspective, from our education situation, from the social point of view? What is it that needs to, and then of course the economy encouraging this, and then what will mean is that we need to deal with things like load shedding, because it is affecting our economy. That is why our economy is struggling to grow. Every time it tries to grow, then load shedding cuts it.
So they also talk about eliminating job corruption, nepotism in people being appointed, tackling labor unions by limiting the rights of members, amongst others. Hold those thoughts. We're going to catch up with the marchers. Let's see where they are, making their way, of course, from Church Square here to the Union buildings. Let's go to Kani Mapanga to find out what her vantage point is. Kani?
All right, these are live pictures, of course. Thank you very much, SABC News anchor Sakina Kamwendo, Mzwandile Mbeje, political editor here at the SABC, as well as Dr. Ronesh. Those, of course, live pictures, if we could show you those once again. Those live pictures from Tshwane. Though that is, of course, the sea of blue that is making its way. We'll show you in just a second those visuals of those members and supporters of the Democratic Alliance, who are, of course, headed to the launch of the election manifesto, led, of course, by DA leader John Steenhuisen.